Милость мира, жертву хваления и со духом
A few years before Alex Jones came on the air, in the mid-90s, Aleksandr Dugin, dubbed the most dangerous man in the world, joined the editorial board of the newspaper Din, meaning day, in December 1990. Din and Dugin would go on to support the August 19, 1991 coup, led by high-ranking Soviet officials, for the prevention of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. On the one side, you had Boris Yeltsin leading the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFSR, and on the other side you had Mikhail Gorbachev representing the USSR. It was Gorbachev who was placed under house arrest at his vacation spot in Crimea by conservatives leading the coup. He was placed under house arrest because he was failing to prevent the dissolution of the USSR, according to Dugin in his book The Last War of the World Island. If we are to believe what the Russians tell us, the coup failed 3 days later. However, there is some evidence that it was contrived by both sides at the highest levels to fail in order to initiate a new Operation Trust, which would open up the Soviet Union to Western investment and technology, which was badly needed at the time. The power structures of the Soviet Union would only appear to collapse while going into the shadows. Communist researcher and Soviet defector interviewer J.R. Nyquist has published evidence on this subject.
And it was actually thought that Menzhinsky, the deputy underneath Felix Dzerzhinsky, spoke fluent Mandarin and was very fascinated by China, knew all about China's strategies, and had used these strategies in something called Operation Trust in the 1920s. There was a sort of minor faking of the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1920s. That's what Operation Trust was. So in order to understand what Golitsyn is saying, is you got to go back in history and say the Soviets already did a fake collapse in the 1920s. They had captured some white generals. There was a civil war between white generals and red generals in Russia, the Russian Civil War. And the Reds won, but they captured these white generals who ran this monarchist alliance of Central Russia. And they took it over. The secret police, the Soviet secret police, later called the KGB, took it over in the 1920s and created a fake anti-Soviet organization that they then made all the Western intelligence services, they all believed it. They all believed because they sent agents out saying, look, we've infiltrated the secret police, we've infiltrated the Red Army, we've infiltrated the Soviet government, we basically control everything. And people believed it. You know, even Lenin, and then Lenin did his NEP. Lenin retreated into state capitalism. A GRU defector, Colonel Stanislav Lunev, told me that in the division of the world, China is going to get the lower 48 states. And if you read Chiao Chen's speech of 20 years ago, he was the defense minister of China. He said that they made a deal, they made a trade of land in the north to get what they wanted, the lower 48 states, because they need to make a second China here and they need to exterminate the American population because China's overpopulated it and they need to move their population somewhere, and the United States is where they need to move it. So, and Lunev said they had made an agreement in I think around 1991 before his defection. And at the last meeting that he attended of the Russian generals, they said, this is the war plan. This is how we're going to divide North America. Russia's going to get Alaska and parts of Canada. China's going to get the lower 48 states with other countries invited in for looting rights.
One piece of evidence for this theory worth mentioning here is the case of Vladimir Kryakov. Kryakov was the chairman of the KGB of the USSR. Back in the late 80s, he was putting a lot of pressure on his KGB officers, about 12,000 under his command, to recruit Americans, especially ones that showed promise for American politics. It was during his tenure as head of the Foreign Intelligence Arm of the KGB, or First Directorate, and with the aid of Soviet official Vitaly Churkin, that Donald Trump's visit to Moscow in 1987 was made possible. After returning from his Moscow visit with the guidance of Roger Stone, Trump published full-page ads in the Boston Globe, Washington Post, and New York Times calling for the United States to stop spending money to defend Japan and the Persian Gulf, foreshadowing his suggestion during his presidency that the U.S. might stop funding NATO or even pull out of NATO, an objective of Dugin's and also part of the Libertarian Party platform. Kryakov, sensing the fall of the Soviet Union, created a plan in March 1991, months before the coup, for his agents to launch about 600 companies run by retired KGB officers. Quoting Craig Unger, all agents in the operation were instructed to do whatever they could to gain a commercial foothold that would enable them to be self-sustaining. The companies were there not merely to provide cover for intelligence operatives. They were there to function as real companies, as major corporations, to make money, to finance operations against the West, to launder money, and to gather intelligence that could be used against the West. This was the kind of expertise that would serve Putin well in the future as it became clear what shape the new Russia would take. Thousands of KGB agents were potentially taking the Soviet Union into the shadows, while a fake coup would make the West believe the Soviet Union had collapsed. Dugin publicly supported the coup in '91 via the newspaper Den, yet somehow he was allowed to continue to operate after the coup failed. Den later changed its name to Zavtra, or Tomorrow. Dugin's backstory is interesting. He comes from a military family. His father, grandfather, and great-grandfather were all Russian military officers. His father was a 3-star colonel general in the Russian Military Intelligence, or GRU, and he was busted down to a customs control position after Dugin got in trouble in 1983 for performing an anti-Soviet song at a concert in Moscow. Dugin became a KGB informant after his bust and later ended up in a group called Pamyat, or Memory, which was run by a KGB informant. Byline Times noted he then made several trips to Europe. Trips abroad for citizens with KGB arrest records were not granted unless they served as informants or recruiters. It was during this time that he had met Claudio Muti, who then traveled to Russia to lecture on geopolitics. Muti would then go on to take directorship of the Italian Journal of Geopolitics. A short aside, Michael Chosadowski, who Alex Jones had on multiple times, and whose globalresearch.ca made it into a State Department report for publishing GRU articles, is on the scientific committee for Muti's journal. Muti is also editor of the Eurasian Journal of Geopolitics and contributor to Dugin's Geopolitica.ru, which is now sanctioned. In the early 90s, Dugin was contributing to Den, but also editing his own journal called Elements, and founded a publishing house called Arcto-Gaia, meaning Northland. The newspaper Den was quite an important convergence point. Former FSB director Aleksandr Dugin, hired by Dugin associate and sanctioned Putin oligarch Konstantin Malafeev, worked there. Dugin later became prime minister of the Donetsk People's Republic. Malafeev also had, as head of his security, former Den Zavtra contributor Igor Girkin. Israel Shamir, both Dugin associate and Julian Assange associate, worked there as well. It was around this time that the Russian School of Geopolitics was stood up. Dugin published his early works on the subject through Den and the journal Elements. It was through Alexander Prokhanov, the founder of Den, that Dugin got his position at the Russian Academy of the General Staff, which educates mid- and high-level officers, most graduating with 1 star or higher, through General Igor Rodionov, the commander of the academy. Rodionov was appointed defense minister in '96, and Dugin subsequently worked for that department's magazine called Landmarks. In 1995, Dugin ran for the Russian State Duma on a national Bolshevik platform, but he was resoundingly rejected by voters, says John B. Dunlap of Stanford. That same year, we find a grainy video of Dugin reciting lines from occultist Aleister Crowley. An explanation of this can perhaps indirectly be found in his interest in René Guénon. Guénon discusses in his Crisis of the Modern World, 1927, that the West is not a traditional civilization. It recognizes no higher principle, but in reality is based only on a negation of principles, is by this very fact ruled out from all mutual understanding with other civilizations. For if such understanding is to be profound and effective, it can only come from above. That is to say, from the very factor that this abnormal and perverted civilization lacks. Guénon believed we are in the last phase of what Hindus call the Kali Yuga, the darkest period of the Dark Age, the state of dissolution from which it is impossible to emerge otherwise than by a cataclysm. Dugin confirms he believes this as well in his book, The Fourth Political Theory. However, we find a more concrete explanation of Dugin's interest in Crowley from a 1998 issue of Fronda. The context was a discussion about the geopolitical problem of Poland, that it is a part of the West in the sense that it is Catholic, but a part of the East in the sense that it is Slavic. This pull between the West and the East contributed to its inability to define itself, that is, Poland, Lithuania, and why its civilization disappeared, according to Dugin. Dugin then states the best thing about Polish history is the Jewish tradition in small towns in eastern Poland. Quote, "In fact, I am interested in everything that was anti-Catholic in Poland, Polish Freemasonry and occultist." Tying this together and back into the thought of Guénon, in 1995, Dugin wrote from his website, Fourth Political Theory, that the Masonic circles had, from the 17th century onwards, absorbed the whole specter of non-Catholic spirituality and non-Catholic thought. And we can assume that Dugin believes there are remnants of this traditional civilization in the West in these circles. Interestingly, he says, quote, "Russian and Greek Orthodox priests who were sent to work in the West were more keen on contacting the Masons and occultists than contacting the limited and intellectually totalitarian Catholic leaders."
Я прошу почтить память умершего Алистера Кроули минутой молчания. Если есть в зале какие-нибудь зажигалки или спички, вы можете зажечь и минуту помолчать.
О мой Бог! Един Твой исток, един Твой дух, едино Твое изменение. Позволь мне воспеть Твои совершенства перед людьми. В образе шестиконечной звезды, сверкающей сквозь глупые своды, позволь мне объявить о Твоих совершенствах. Ты явился мне как очень старый Бог, достопочтимый Бог, господин времени с острым серпом. Ты явился мне как радостный и довольный Бог, исполненный могущества король, Отец, в самом рассвете сил, с жезлом вселенной.
Turning our attention away from Dugin's esotericism and the occult, he had gained some prominence in the 90s, despite his poor performance in the elections, and in 1997, the same year Brzezinski published his geopolitical work, The Grand Chessboard, Dugin published his book as well, titled The Foundations of Geopolitics, which was and probably still is required reading for officers in the General Staff Academy. This textbook cites the Englishman John Halford Mackinder's Heartland thesis, something both Bannon and Posobiec refer to as well, but are dishonest about it in the sense that they downplay the importance of East Europe. Mackinder predicted if the Eastern issue, that is, creating stable, independent states between Germany and Russia, wasn't solved during his time, future generations, quote, will find themselves under the necessity of marshaling their power afresh for the siege of the heartland, meaning Russia, end quote. Mackinder's Heartland thesis states, "Who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world." Dugin, thinking in the domain of geopolitical science, called for in his book, counteracting U.S. Atlantist geopolitics at all levels and in all regions of the world, trying to weaken, demoralize, deceive, and ultimately defeat the enemy as much as possible. It is especially important to bring geopolitical turmoil into the U.S. domestic reality by encouraging all kinds of separatism, various ethnic, social, and racial conflicts, actively supporting all dissident movements of extremist, racist, sectarian groups that destabilize internal political processes in the USA. At the same time, it makes sense to support isolationist tendencies in U.S. politics, the thesis of those often right-wing Republican circles that believe that the U.S. should confine itself to its domestic problems. Advancing to 2008 and quoting Dugin regarding the Georgian-Russian War, for 5 years the Georgian side actively prepared for new military actions and began an operation to seize South Ossetia on August 7, 2008. On the night of August 8th, rocket fire on Skinvali began and grad launchers, and Georgian troops began their assault on the city using tanks. The same day, they seized the city and began to exterminate the population. The Georgian-Russian War then brought Dugin to Russian-aligned South Ossetia. He had reportedly traveled there in June, as well as late August, before and after the conflict. It was during this time that his phrase, "tanks to Tbilisi," was widely publicized by Russian radio, TV, and press. And this is where Aleksandr Dugin's and Alex Jones's paths might have first crossed, if not earlier. In 2008, Alex Jones was saying on his own program and Russian state television that, "My country has been taken over by private international military-industrial complex," and they launched a sneak attack on the Russian enclaves of South Ossetia on the order of Pearl Harbor. "I just hope Russia keeps troops in Georgia, so no more sneak attacks can be launched." Jones completely sided with the Russian side. In the book War for Eternity, Teitelbaum gives a good summary of the Western side. Quoting him, "Throughout July and into August 2008, Russians began pouring through a nearly 2.5-mile Roki tunnel under the Caucasus Mountains and into South Ossetia. Russia had established a much criticized peacekeeping mission in the area, but these weren't peacekeepers. They were bringing armored vehicles and soldiers too. Indeed, as the month wore on, the separatist army's ranks grew increasingly international, with personnel from the Russian army, as well as volunteer fighters from neighboring regions to the north. Heavy shelling in South Ossetia began on August 1st, 2008. Separatist forces targeted multiple ethnic Georgian villages inside the Ossetian territory. Meanwhile, the separatists also attacked Georgian security forces with roadside bombs and conventional fire. The central government in Tbilisi thought that its past standard of limited sniper fire was an insufficient response to the latest escalations. So on August 7th, it launched a full-scale military assault on the South Ossetian city of Tbilisi, surrounding and pounding it throughout the day and night, and pushing into the city center during early morning. It was at this time that Dugin was on TV and radio calling for the Russians to capture the Georgian capital, Tbilisi, to show that the fate of the world was not to be subsumed into a single unipolar global liberal order, but instead that it would be a multipolar order. He famously said, "Tanks to Tbilisi," in the statement. Alex Jones would appear later that year on RT again, and appeared to be reading from Dugin's script. He clearly stated he was interested in a multipolar world order and not a unipolar world. This is the objective outlined in Dugin's Foundations of Geopolitics. It is to break the Anglo-American unipolar world order. In this respect, Dugin and Alex were natural allies.
All journalists blame Russia for the conflict. Alex Jones from the Infowars.com website claims rather that American viewers have been deceived by the coverage.
First off, let me say I am ashamed as an American. I'm a loyal American who loves my country, but my country has been taken over by a private international military-industrial complex, and they launched the sneak attack on the Russian enclaves of Abkhazia and other areas, as you know, on 8/88, using the cover of the Olympic Games and a dastardly sneak attack on the order of Pearl Harbor in World War II. And I am just so ashamed that our country's been hijacked and is being used to do this. I was watching foreign news, and I knew that the U.S.-backed Georgians, the Israeli and NATO-backed Georgians had snuck attacked viciously and were hunting down and killing civilians, attacking the peacekeepers, just unprecedented crimes in our modern age, the 21st century. And then I would turn on CNN and Fox and even BBC, and they were reporting that Russia, it was headlines, Russia invades Georgia, Russia sneak attacks. And our leaders went on television and said that we would have to have a new Cold War. It was such an insult to the American people's intelligence that the United States backed Georgia. And I apologize as an American that we've let our government been taken over like this, and this is not the United States that I grew up in. The neocons in NATO, in the U.S. and Israel, want to have a new Cold War. I just hope Russia keeps troops in Georgia so no more sneak attacks can be launched, because the dictator, and we know he was elected under fraud, there in Georgia, has said that he plans, he said it last week, to attack again as soon as he can. So please, Russia does not need to leave these areas that have been part of Russia for years, Abkhazia and Ossetia, because we don't want violence. The American people don't want this. We want to be friends with Russia. The Anglo-American Western New World Order system based in, of course, London and New York and D.C. They have hijacked the U.S. They have implemented continuity of government. They have geared up for martial law. They've built FEMA camps here. They're destroying our republic. They're destroying our freedoms. They're coming after the free press. And so they're using NATO expansion as a way to widen a war throughout Central Asia and then to the west through Eastern Europe and Central Europe. And I really appreciate the fact that Russia has been restrained in all.
We have the Anglo-American establishment based in England and the United States that has enslaved our people. And they are using our wealth, our military, our name to carry out this globalist empire, this unipolar world, instead of having a multipolar world.
In his August 4th, 2017 interview with Dugin, Alex stated he was familiar with Dugin's works going back about 10 years, which would put the date in the 2007 to 2008 range, right around the time Alex was taking Russia's side.
Of course, misrepresenting, and look, you know, this is the crazy advisor to Putin, kind of the same thing they do to Trump, just knowing that Dugin represents a big base of smart, informed Russians that know what's happening and have a nationalist global view in understanding the real threat. So it's not that we're plagiarizing each other, that we're saying similar things. He wrote a lot of this 30 years ago. I wasn't familiar with his work until about 10 years ago.
Both Alex and Dugin were widely circulated in Russian media at the time, and Dugin, being fluent in English, would likely have caught Alex on Russian TV supporting the Russian side, and Dugin would have taken note, because he was very much interested in building alliances not only in Europe, but also in the United States, which was Russia's primary enemy, according to his foundations of geopolitics. Alex would continue to do interviews with RT over the next few years, and he became very popular in Russia. His friend Max Kaiser, who is connected to Putin, who we mentioned in part 2, would have him on his own RT program a few times as well. The RT appearances seem to have stopped by 2013, and Alex provides an explanation for this. He alleges the Obama White House had contacted RT and told them to not have him on air again, or they would lose their U.S. license. Alex then said RT really didn't like him because he would talk about Stalin and Lenin unfavorably, and RT wasn't about that. Two things with this. First, it shows that Russia was protecting the image of mass murderers, and two, if RT didn't like Alex, why did he keep appearing on their program until the White House threatened to shut down RT-US? When Alex made that statement, it was March 8, 2014, days before the Russian annexation of Crimea on March 18, 2014. Sanctions were going into effect around this time, and we see recurring guests like globalresearches.ca, Michael Chosadowski, and Michael Maloof, former senior security policy analyst in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, who are both likely foreign intelligence compromised, begin to drop off the InfoWars program. There was additional distancing that would take place between then and into 2017-2018. InfoWars associates like Paul Joseph Watson had articles published on the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, or SVR, Task Strategic Culture Foundation, or SCF, website, as well as globalresearch.ca, which was a partner to FCF, republished Russian Federal Security Service Task South Front articles, as well as Russian military intelligence writers' articles. Jay Dyer was also a contributor to globalresearch.ca, as well as sanctioned Putin oligarch Konstantin Malafeev's Katahan. Of all the people on InfoWars, Jay Dyer, frequent InfoWars 4th Hour host, is probably the intellectual successor to Alex Jones in the sense that he has a massive home library and has a wide breadth and depth of understanding of subjects that Alex covers and considers the core of his messaging. Dyer's interest in the occult, the ruling elite, and Orthodox Christianity was probably how he got in contact with Dugin. Dugin being interested in everything anti-Catholic, Freemasonry, and the occult. On his March 16, 2016 interview with Dugin, Dyer stated he listened to Dugin's talks and read a lot of his pieces over the years, but it is unknown if he was familiar with Dugin's plans for destabilizing the United States or his Russian intelligence ties. It is also unclear if Dyer introduced Dugin to Alex Jones.
Some of the things that have stood out to me, I've listened to your talks and read a lot of your pieces over the years, and what stands out to me is a lot of the philosophical critiques. I'm a philosophy student myself.
However Dugin got in contact with Alex, through Dyer or perhaps Max Kaiser, the connection was made public when Alex appeared on Konstantin Malafeev's Tsargrad TV network on December 20th, 2016. Alex hired Russian-American Daria Karpova a few years earlier, and she would go on to translate the interview for English-speaking audiences. Alex told his audience Daria was at the highest levels of special forces, and he hired her for translation work, among other things. Question: why would Alex need Russian translated around the time of the first Ukraine invasion in 2014?
Important.
Now, again, there's an hour of this, and I'm going to have it posted at Infowars.com today with some of the parts that have had a translation put on it. Daria doesn't job. She sounds better than the folks they have on BBC and RT. She does an amazing job. And her parents came here to escape the Soviet Union, and she's a great Army veteran and just done amazing things working here in the last couple of years at InfoWars. But I tell you, Buckley did a great job when her email came through, getting her through, and again, getting her hired so that we can translate these things. But again, how do you pronounce the name of the TV network? I know it's nationwide in Russia, Daria. Because I don't want to pronounce it wrong.
Repeat that question again, Alex.
How do you pronounce the name of the TV network? And there it is on screen.
It's called Tsargrad TV.
And then I guess the website is, what's the URL? We've got it on screen. I don't want to tell folks the URL.
It's tsargrad.tv.
And for the folks that don't know, we had Vice here when they were on, and the guy was flipping out by the people that were on that show. Those are like some of Trump's top advisors. So he was like walking in and they're like, oh my God, you are a Russian agent. What's going on here? And
it should be noted at this point the significance of the name Tsargrad TV. Tsargrad is the Slavic name for the Greek city Byzantium, later called Constantinople, and now known as Istanbul. When the Ottomans took Constantinople, the capital of the East Roman Empire, that is the Byzantine Empire, the emperor died in battle, and one of the last members of the royal line, Zoe Palaeologina, eventually ended up in the care of the papacy in Rome until a marriage was negotiated between her and Ivan III, the Grand Prince of Moscow. It is in this sense that Russia sees itself as the successor to Rome. The Western Empire fell, but it was carried on in the East. The Church split, and the East under the Byzantine Empire maintained East Orthodox Christianity. When the Byzantine Empire fell, the royal bloodline of succession survived in Russia, along with the Eastern faith. Hence, Moscow is viewed by some as the Third Rome. This is reinforced by certain people associated with the traditionalist, though we can argue from just our elementary understanding of Guénon, having read about 130 pages of his work as of writing this, that they depart from Guénon in many ways. That said, traditionalists like Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson have published books on Moscow as the Third Rome, and he said Russia's role is the restrainer against the Antichrist. From the traditionalist perspective, he seems to claim Russia maintains and promotes traditional values, yet our reading of Guénon's East and West, it must be pointed out it was written in 1924, we find Guénon critiquing Russia, Judaism, and Bolshevikism, the second, he said, playing a big influence in the third, nearly as much as participating in modern, Western, anti-traditionalist thought as Protestantism and its offshoots. Quoting Guénon, he says, the Russians, even if they have derived some outward characteristics from the Easterners, they are also as far removed from them intellectually as it is possible to be. This is in the context of the Easterners at the time, according to Guénon, placing metaphysics higher in order than reason, which the West seems to almost exclusively apply to material advancement. Coming back to Dugin for a quick aside in his occult interest, here he seems to diverge from Guénon as well. For Guénon, it wasn't, quote, through occultism that the West will ever be able to recover its own tradition any more than it will be able to rejoin Eastern intellectuality, end quote. As for the concept of Moscow as a Third Rome, it does fit somewhat in the science of geopolitics in the sense that Russia is viewed in Mackinder's terms as a land power, as was Rome. It was remarked to us in private conversation that we cannot take anything by Dugin at face value because he is a magician. We tend to agree with this assessment with the modifier that he does have certain objectives to achieve, and he appears to use elements of Mackinder, traditionalism, and other systems of thought in his brew for achieving those objectives. Now coming back to Dugin and InfoWars, it's hard to say how much Dyer or Alex knew about Dugin without them specifically stating what they read of his, but both said that they had been following him for years and were familiar with his works. It would be hard to miss Dugin's anti-Americanism, often styled anti-Atlanticism or Carthago delenda est, that is, Carthage must be destroyed. Carthage, of course, being the United States. Also, I wonder if Dyer or Alex knew both Dugin and the owner of Tsargrad TV, Konstantin Malafeev, were under sanctions. Malafeev received his on December 19th, 2014, and Dugin his on March 11th, 2015, for threatening the peace, security, stability, or sovereignty or territorial integrity of Ukraine. Their viewers were never warned of this and passed off Dugin as an above-board advisor and philosopher. In his book, Last War of the World Island, 2015 English edition, Dugin makes it clear his central role in establishing the post-Soviet school of Russian geopolitics. His work published in Den and the publication's support for the preservation of the Soviet Union. Mackinder is cited as well, someone both Dyer and Alex are familiar with, though perhaps only by proxy of having read Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard. Both would know from Brzezinski that Ukraine's independence is central to preventing Russia from becoming a Eurasian empire, and would therefore understand Dugin, son of a three-star GRU general, a founder of Russian geopolitics, an adjunct professor of the highest Russian military academy, would be seeking to regain Ukraine for Russia. It would have been nearly impossible for Dyer or Alex to not understand this with some basic journalistic research into Dugin. To have followed him over the years and not know this is quite unbelievable if their statements about following him and reading his work are true. Now, this is Vladimir Putin's favorite TV show. Just what you're watching. It's on record. You can look it up. In fact, I'll play another clip and tell you all about the station and the national network. But this is what they're preaching. Christianity, family, battling the globalists, battling the New World Order. They've thrown the oligarchs out. They want America to throw out the globalists as well, and Europe. It's not the Russians behind it. We're in solidarity with the Russians. And this is what they're claiming is Russia manipulating America. No, our Americana ideas are going into Russia more than their ideas here. And they basically say that. Let's go to some clips that have been translated.
I'm very happy that Alex Jones is live with us right now. We have been following you, Alex, for many years, including myself personally. And when you became truly celebrated in this new era of Donald Trump, I marveled at you. The fact that such people as yourself, who embody such free and independent points of view, which are shared in reality by millions of people, Americans and worldwide, and millions of Russian people, how you became a hero of this campaign, how you told the truth while everyone else lied, how you held your ground fearlessly against all the attacks and all the dirt that they were throwing your way. And whether it be Russians, Europeans, Asians, or Turks, for us, you were an example of a true American man, the true American spirit. You, Alex, have changed our view of who a real American is. If the American people are anything like you, then the attitude toward your country, toward your people, will be radically changed. And when Donald Trump won, whom you supported, and whom we were all also in solidarity with, when you and him and all of us won, I said this:
Anti-Americanism is over.
Anti-Americanism is over. Now the people of the free United States, free Russia, and all the anti-globalist powers worldwide have to build a new world, new architecture. We are exceedingly glad to see you on our program, broadcasting live right now. And from the bottom of our hearts, we thank you for being the genuine face of real America.
Decades ago, I knew we could form an opposition to it, as I've said thousands of times. Even if you've only been a listener a few years, you've heard this thousands of times. I say it every day. You expose globalists, you expose their system, you expose how anti-human it is, how it's a technocracy based on the end of humanity as we know it, a eugenics-based system. Everyone will want to resist it because it's so evil. But it's all about hoaxes and false realities and confusing everyone and misrepresenting countries and playing us off against each other. But the moment people click and break through that, it's all over. There's no coming back. And every fiber of you then wants to see human prosperity, human destiny fulfilled. And you want to see the globalists that want to have some nuclear war death wish, some satanic Ragnarok fall.